done. It's very hard to say it shouldn't have happened. It really shouldn't have happened.
They died trying to join the SAS, but neglect and poor planning helped kill them.
They displayed no responsibility, no accountability, and no humility for their role in creating the culture which led to the events of the 13th of July 2013.
Today's inquest exposed gross failures and damning truths about the risks taken by the Army.
We are truly sorry for all the mistakes that the coroner identified today.
Tonight, we follow the route of the fatal march on the Brecon Beacons, and we ask why no one stopped it before it was too late.
This is your last event. You obviously know what you're here for, and it is the toughest, and I'll make no bones about that. This is the toughest route that you'll do.
They're about to follow in the footsteps of soldiers aiming to join the SAS.
This is where it's going to test you both navigationally and physically and mentally.
The test is to march 16 miles across the Brecon Beacons, carrying 50-pound packs on their backs. Ex-Special Forces soldier Jason Birch passed the military test, and now he runs a company giving civilians a taste of what it's like.
It's very tough, it's very demanding. As I say, this is an infamous part of test week, an infamous part of selection itself. You're giving it your all, you're determined, you've trained hard for it, you're single-minded in wanting to finish it.
This event is helping to raise money for a veterans charity. It's being supported by the father of Corporal James Dunsby, one of the 3 reservists who died after taking part in the SAS selection test 2 years ago.
I'll miss him. I wasn't there to catch him when he fell. I wasn't there to help him. And sometimes you feel responsible for that as a parent. One of the other parents did the same thing. So I knew I wasn't alone.
After James died, David completed his son's unfinished journey across the Beacons. He says he feels close to him there, in the mountains.
But I don't have a headstone. I don't have his ashes. I just got there. I find peace. I can talk to him. That day I was on the mountain, I'm pretty certain I talked to him when I was deciding to give up. And I half expect him to come out from behind a tree and says, "What are you doing, old man? Better go home."
Yesterday was the 2nd anniversary of the tragedy which claimed Corporal Dunsby's life, and those of reservists Craig Roberts from Conwy and Edward Mayer from Hampshire. When you walk this route, the scale of the challenge is all too clear. For 2 years, the families have been asking the same question. Could these deaths have been prevented? So far, no one has been prosecuted over what happened here. At the inquest, the Army were asked to account for why they hadn't followed their own safety guidelines, why there weren't any more medics and radios. There were questions, too, about equipment, and why some witnesses couldn't remember vital facts. Craig Roberts was 24 and from Penryn Bay. He was a teaching assistant who joined the Territorial Army. Lance Corporal Edward Mayer from Hampshire had previously been a full-time soldier. This was his 2nd attempt at the SAS test. Corporal James Dunsby from Bath was married and worked as a military analyst. As a reserve soldier, he'd served alongside Prince Harry in Afghanistan.
He was my first, and I was very proud of him. He wasn't happy unless he got his 100% in his exams, and he strived for perfection. We know these men, they'll go into the mountains, they'll go and do a job in Afghanistan or somewhere else, and they'll fight in extreme conditions. But at the end of the day, this was training. And this was the United Kingdom. And this was the Brecon Beacons.
The families arrived at the inquest today hoping for an uncompromising verdict. The coroner's conclusions were devastating. There'd been a complacent attitude to risk, gross failures, and a delay in treatment amounting to neglect.
They displayed no responsibility, no accountability, and no humility for their role in creating the culture which led to the events of the 13th of July 2013. Even an ounce of this would have gone such a long way in acknowledging the vast catalogue of errors which were so clearly made. James would have been so hugely disappointed by the behaviour of an organisation for which he had fought for and to which he ultimately lost his life.
Craig Roberts' parents said they'd be making a statement later, and the family of Edward Mayer said that while they supported the Special Forces, training must be fit for purpose.
It's a great day already across Wales, temperatures rising quite nicely, 14 in Sennybridge, and the sunshine will remain this afternoon and the temperatures will continue to rise over the next few hours.
That day, 78 soldiers, regulars and reservists were competing for a coveted place in the ranks of the SAS, whose famous motto is, "Who dares wins." The Special Forces test route takes in sharp ascents and descents on unforgiving terrain. The men who died had to navigate between checkpoints where directing staff were waiting. But the failure of those in charge to properly assess the risks that day was an important factor which led to 3 deaths and other soldiers going down with heat-related injuries.
VW to 0, say again, over.
Former Special Forces soldiers who've passed the test say it has to be as tough as possible for reservists and regulars.
I went through our selection in summer '95, and we started with 210 people, and we finished selection, 10 of us passed. We've got the best Special Forces in the world. There's absolutely no reason to make this easier or easy. The reason we're selecting these guys is because they are hard as nails.
But a combination that day of high temperature, high humidity and strong sun made the risks even more dangerous. According to the MOD's own heat safety guidelines, the test should have been stopped hours before the men collapsed. And this was the first big mistake.
James died and he shouldn't have done. Craig died and he shouldn't have done. Edward died and he shouldn't have done. You don't die in this country of heat stress. They did. And it was important to find out why. And it's very important that it doesn't happen again.
We simulate conditions across the world here, mainly to look at the impact of both cold and heat. We can study the physiological responses and look at how they respond to heat.
Professor George Havenith gave evidence at the inquest. He's an expert in how the body deals with extreme temperatures. He was asked to study what happened to the 3 soldiers that day.
We have a very heavy march, about 60 pounds, clothing, weapon and backpack and water together. So a very heavy load, which had to be done at speed. And to that we add a very unusual climate. Virtually no wind, which I think was crucial, sunshine and a very high temperature. So that together is almost like what you call a perfect storm.
So why didn't those in charge that day see it coming? It's a question Craig Roberts' parents, Margaret and Kelvin, raised at the inquest. They said when they went to identify his body, they asked a senior officer to explain why they sent the men up the mountain in that heat. They claimed they were told cancelling it would have involved too much paperwork. The officer told the coroner he couldn't recall saying that. In Penryn Bay, those who knew Craig said he was a young man who thrived on a challenge.
He was a high achiever. One of the things which caused him to be a good student and a very successful student was his determination to succeed.
Viv Morgan taught Craig in the sixth form at Ysgol John Bright in Llandudno. After university, Craig joined the Territorial Army, and the SAS was his ultimate aim.
He would have really pushed himself to achieve his goal. I mean, he wanted to get into the group that he wanted to, which was very high standards, and Craig would have tried his damnedest to get into those. What a shame it was, really, that a young man should be cut short in his prime.
By late morning that day, the temperature had risen above 24 degrees. The men were 4 hours into the test, near checkpoint 3. By this point, 2 other soldiers had already collapsed with symptoms of heat illness.
Symptoms for that are dizziness, fatigue again, of course, headaches, but also things like confusion, and in worst case, even that the sweating stops. And of course, as soon as the sweating stops, your body temperature will rocket. Very often the kidneys shut down, the liver shut down, so you get what we call multi-organ failure.
So we're feeling 546?
Good, thanks, Staff.
Been drinking?
Yeah, plenty.
Eating?
Yeah, Staff.
Spotting the signs is vital.
Yes.
Today, the competitors are challenging themselves. For the Special Forces test, checkpoint staff give the men water and question them to make sure they're fit to carry on.
Down to the car park, fill up with your water.
Staff.
One of the symptoms of the heat injuries is confusion, and that's one of the reasons why they go through this kind of simulated question scenario with you. These kind of injuries can be missed purely because the nature of this route march itself, there won't be a lot of difference in the way you look from someone suffering from a heat injury to someone that's just absolutely shattered from doing the route march itself.
Yeah, that's great.
The men were wearing tracking devices sending a signal back to a command vehicle. The system is designed to track the progress of the candidate so that if anyone got into difficulty, the men in charge would know. This was one of the military's toughest tests. An enormous challenge on any day. But on that day, the temperatures were in the high 20s and the risks were even greater. That day, by 1 o'clock, 2 other soldiers had collapsed. By now, alarm bells should have been ringing, but they weren't. And this was the second big mistake.
The exercise should have been stopped. So whatever the people on the ground would say, the documentation states the first case of heat illness, you have to stop the exercise.
There is official MOD guidance on how to avoid and deal with heat illness.
The people didn't really know what was inside the document, so even though they referred to it, they didn't really know what to do. And I think that's a crucial part, and I think if the risk assessment would have been done properly, including the knowledge of the heat stress document, I'm sure these deaths could have been prevented.
Checkpoint 5, next to this line of trees, was an important focal point in the inquest. It was the last checkpoint that Lance Corporals Mayer and Roberts passed through before they collapsed. Beyond this, they faced a steep uphill climb, and the inquest was told that had they been stopped here, they would have survived. Craig Roberts was heading towards one of the toughest parts of the course.
Well, VW Valley, it stands for Voluntary Withdrawal Valley, and the name speaks for itself. It's infamous upon the course, and a lot of guys, yeah, they voluntarily withdraw at this point because of how steep it is. The ingredients are all there for a bigger risk.
Craig tried cooling himself in the river, but he didn't make it out of the valley. This is where Craig Roberts was found after he collapsed. At the inquest, one of the recruits said they tried for 2 hours to save his life, but it was too late. The men needed urgent help, but it didn't come quickly enough.
We know that in heat illness and heat stroke, you have to be there in the first 30 minutes with aggressive cooling in order to give a good chance of survival. So if you don't find them for an hour to 2 hours, the chance of these people surviving is, of course, very low.
Ten minutes after Craig Roberts was found, command vehicle staff checked Edward Mayer's progress and saw his tracker had remained static for nearly 2 hours. Delays in spotting the men were down was the third big mistake. The coroner said it amounted to neglect. When Lance Corporal Mayer was found, he was still clutching a bottle of water and a half-eaten chocolate bar. At the inquest, one of his colleagues said that he tried to save him for 45 minutes single-handedly because a rescue vehicle was bogged down. James Dunsby had made good progress, and no one spotted signs of heat illness at his last checkpoint on the top of Pen y Fan. But when colleagues checked his tracker, they realised it had also stopped moving. He'd collapsed near the main A470 road.
If they would have been treated quicker, they would have had some chance of survival. Given his position close to the road, being close to the road would have meant they could have get him out very quickly and start treating him very quickly, but that didn't happen.
Failures in communication and poor monitoring of the tracking system were all highlighted by the coroner.
They were not monitoring Edward, they were not monitoring Craig, so there was a fault. And if it's the system, that needs to be changed. If it's the way it's run, that needs to be changed. Obviously the tracker system wasn't fit for purpose.
Corporal Dunsby was taken off the mountain alive, but he'd suffered major organ failure.
Once they told me his kidneys had failed, I knew the process of what was happening. I knew what was going to go next. I knew a progressive illness, but I wanted to be wrong. And I wanted him to just bounce back. But I think the underlying damage was the fact is he sat up there for 50 minutes before anybody got to him.
James Dunsby died in hospital 16 days later. The families discovered the MOD had been due to spend £1.5 million upgrading the tracking system used by their sons. It emerged that 2 years earlier, the Army had committed to improving the system so that casualties could be spotted earlier. But those changes hadn't been completed. 4 years ago, at the inquest of another Special Forces hopeful, Marine Benjamin Poole, the MOD acknowledged it needed to respond quicker to signals that recruits weren't moving. He suffered heart failure doing the same test. The MOD said lessons would be learned. Software was upgraded. But by the time the three men died, further improvements still hadn't been made. And the coroner found the tracking system wasn't fit for purpose.
The fact that when people collapsed, they weren't noticed as not moving and medical help wasn't got to them quick enough is appalling.
Madeleine Moon chairs the UK Parliament's all-party group on reservists and cadets.
The issue for me is whether those tracking devices and the failure to improve on them was part of the cuts that the military had been facing.
Would you suspect they were?
I suspect that's what happened there.
I mean, these are life-saving devices, aren't they?
As part of the Strategic Defence Review, we lost a lot of money that was going to the armed forces. It could well be that the equipment that the personnel who died were wearing was not of the quality that they needed, because as part of the cuts, the new equipment wasn't bought.
We asked the MOD if budget cuts were to blame, but they refused to tell us.
So we got a packet of people there.
Former SAS soldier Rob Paxman says the men who died deserved better.
So if I'm out there running an operation, I'll make sure that all the boxes are ticked, that we've done a threat assessment, a risk assessment, and put the correct measures in place to mitigate the risk. It's absolutely inexcusable that they have not had the correct assets in place, the correct monitoring systems in place, and probably the correct people in place to safeguard life. It's an incredibly difficult test. Selection is not easy at all. Yeah? But what you can do is you can actually start looking after the guys a bit better.
This is another Special Forces exercise going dramatically wrong. This MOD footage shows Daniel Wright plunging to the ground. The 25-year-old from Cwmbran was 2,500 feet up.
His parachute had failed to open properly, and he delayed cutting away to the emergency chute. I understand it was 1.5 seconds too late. I later learned it actually was probably a preventable accident. This is a picture of Daniel getting a bit faded now, I'm afraid, in his Gurkha uniform, and his beret, and the flag here, the Union flag, is the flag that was draped on Daniel's coffin on the day of his funeral.
In 2005, Daniel had just completed Special Forces training in Brecon. He was undergoing the next stage, parachute training in Oxfordshire. Carol wanted to see for herself what had gone wrong, so she went to the scene and studied the evidence.
It was traumatic to see, of course, and to see, his body in the ditch beside the road. That was extremely traumatic. But, he's my boy. I had to know what had happened to him right up until the moment of his death.
At the time, trainees weren't given radios to listen to instructors on the ground. Loud hailers were used. But after Daniel's death, Carol was sent a leaked MOD email written months earlier. It warned there could be a major incident unless radios were introduced.
Oh, I was horrified and very angry that they could have put my son's life at risk, and that those warnings had not been heeded.
The MOD said a board of inquiry found no procedural or training failures. There'd been 30,000 successful jumps without incident. The coroner ruled that Daniel's death could have been avoided if he'd had a radio. And they've now been introduced for trainee parachutists.
Do they think that men are invincible? This is flesh and blood here, and even more so for the young men who died in the beacons. They weren't even professional soldiers. Daniel was a professional soldier. These men weren't. They were volunteers. So, no, I think it's unforgivable. The MOD doesn't learn by its mistakes and stop waiting until good men die.
Reservists are part-time soldiers, and many have civilian day jobs. On that day, 3 died and 7 others needed medical attention. They hadn't been acclimatized in the heat to the same extent as regular soldiers, despite MOD safety guidance. The director of Special Forces at the time told the coroner he'd been unaware and surprised by that. Historically, training had been the same.
Now, if we look at the soldiers in the field on the day, the regular troops had worked all week long and the temperature was slowly increasing over the week. Now, if we go to the reservists, who of course came from their normal working environment, from their homes into the location for the weekend, straight went into this very heavy exercise. They were not acclimatized. And acclimatization has a big impact on how well you perform and how well you can cope with the heat. So compared to the regular soldiers, there was a big difference.
The government plans to rely far more on reservists in the future. But this case has raised the question about whether it's right for the MOD to recruit part-time volunteers into special forces.
These three very brave and strong young men desperately wanted to prove themselves and push themselves too far.
Are we expecting too much of them? Are there some roles that, unless they were full-time, they should not be part of?
To be honest, I think reservists would be insulted by that suggestion. They would want to know that anything that a regular can do, they should be able to do if they so wished.
Will you have enough hours in the day to dedicate yourself to it in the way that a professional does?
And again, I take you back to, that's down to training and risk assessing.
The coroner said those in charge failed to amend the risk assessment that day. The medical and evacuation plans were inadequate, and there wasn't enough water to cool casualties. 2 years after losing his son, David Dunsby has been left with unanswered questions and no personal apology.
In the court, everybody come along and I like to apologise, but no one has actually come up and says, I apologise for his death. No one has taken responsibility, because that's what we asked for. Well, that's what I asked for. If somebody could have taken me in months and months ago into a room and said, David, I'm responsible officer on the day, I think I perhaps would have felt a bit better, but nobody did, and I don't really expect them to.
Dyfed-Powys Police investigated the deaths. The Crown Prosecution Service decided there wasn't enough evidence to warrant a criminal prosecution for manslaughter caused by gross negligence. The Health and Safety Executive did find failures in the way risk was assessed, and it's still investigating. But the internal MOD review into what went wrong hasn't been published.
I'd like to see some of that made public. My personal choice would be a public inquiry, so that there is a full examination of what happened. What I wouldn't be happy to see is it just tucked away, forgotten, and we move on.
Madeleine Moon will also be asking the Defence Secretary if budget cuts were the reason why the trackers weren't upgraded sooner. The MOD says the changes will be made by the end of this year. Reservists do now receive the same preparation as regulars, but it refused to tell us whether anyone has been disciplined over what went wrong. The Army kept its response brief, but managed to get Corporal Dunsby's name wrong.
I would like to apologise for the deaths of James Dunsford, Craig Roberts and Edward Mayer, 3 fine soldiers. We must ensure that risks are carefully managed. In this case, we did not do this and accept responsibility.
All the competitors in this civilian event have returned tired but safe. It's been a bittersweet day for David.
I want whatever changes are made not to be done off the hip straight away. They need to sit down and the service inquiry needs to come ahead. What really went wrong? And they need to make positive changes. He's not coming back, but his memory's there. And I hope that he's looking down and thinking, well, we've done the right thing.